Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome back to the next part of my MTG Arena set review for Ravnica Allegiance. Today it's time to start with the first half of the black cards. But before we get started, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button if you're new to the channel, turn on the notification icon to not miss out on the rest of the series and other future content, and please consider whitelisting YouTube on your ad block to help support the free content. That would really mean a lot. And now on to the black cards. Okay, so first we have Awaken the Erstwhile. This card is a bit of a weird one since it is symmetrical and usually ends up punishing one player one way or the other. Either sometimes discarding both players' hand is going to be better for one player or the other, but yeah, if that player has a lot more cards than you and you don't have a good way of dealing with all the zombies they get, you are in trouble. So it seems like it's kind of awkwardly situational. Either you have more cards, but then you don't really want to discard your hand unless your opponent basically dies to the zombies you get from this, and so on. So yeah, it's kind of a strange thing. And even if you have similar amounts of cards, you're basically just discarding both players' hand, taking away a lot of options, and then having the zombies and the rest of what you have fight it out. So yeah, kind of a strange card here. Not sure if there's any potential here. In Constructed and in Limited it's equally weird, so yeah, I would guess this card is not very playable in any format, but let me know in the comments if you think I'm wrong and why. Next we have Bankrupt in Blood. So this is basically a dialed up Altar's Reap type of card. It's a sorcery though, and you have to sacrifice 2 creatures as additional cost, and then you get to draw 3 cards. So the cost is very steep on this. Effectively, you're not even getting an extra card, since you're just getting a card for Bankrupt in Blood and a card for each of the creatures you sacked. The other thing is, since it's not instant, you cannot use it in response to the opponent using a removal or anything, further limiting it and not even allowing you to get virtual card advantage by kind of blanking an opposing removal, making this card pretty underwhelming even in Limited. In Constructed, I don't think there's enough build around payoff for this to matter, and in Limited it's just without build around it's even worse. Sure, it's meant to synergize a bit, I think, with Afterlife and stuff, but still you're probably most of the time better off just keeping your stuff. So yeah, this card seems kind of bad to me, but maybe there's kind of a niche build around use in Constructed for it. I mean, drawing 3 cards for 2 mana is still a pretty good rate if the other cost is not that much of a cost to you, but usually it will be. Next we have Blade Juggler. This is more of a limited card. I don't think it's quite good enough for Constructed, even though it is fairly good for a common, I think. So effectively, in a deck that can support Spectacle well enough, you get a 3 mana 3/2 that replaces itself. So basically a bit better Phyrexian Rager, with the downside of needing to deal damage to the opponent for it to cost the same as a Phyrexian Rager. Although Phyrexian Rager was a pretty strong limited card in some of the formats I was in, and I think this is not going to be much different, especially because the 1 extra power makes a big difference, I think, and lets it trade much better, giving you much more actual 2-for-1 value potential. So yeah, if your deck has enough 2-drops and maybe even some 1-drops to enable this, this seems like a pretty good limited card. Without the Spectacle, it's a bit too weak, I think, overall to end up in the deck. But yeah, most of the time I think you should be fine playing at least one of these in your limited deck, since yeah, who doesn't like 2-for-1s? Next we have Bladebrand, another kind of sweet limited trick. Basically it's a 2 mana cantrip that gives a creature Death Touch. So first of all, can be used on opposing creatures, which is rarely relevant, but just having the option to not only use it on your creatures and randomly use it on the opponent when it matters is a nice bonus. So just wanted to mention that here. But yeah, basically this is kind of a decent trick in Limited, just cycling and allowing you to trade your worst creature for potentially their best creature, which is decent. Like, it's not great, and you probably don't want a lot of these because they can be situational and a bit clunky, but especially the first seems basically free and limited and a very solid addition in most decks. Next we have Blood Mist Infiltrator. This card is surprisingly underwhelming for an uncommon, I think. So we get a 3-mana 3/1, which is pretty weak and fragile, and when it attacks you can sacrifice another creature. If you do, Blood Mist Infiltrator can't be blocked this turn. So that's a pretty high cost for being unblockable for one turn and only having a 3/1 body. So even in Limited this seems pretty underwhelming. The sacrifice payoff just not that huge in this format. It's mostly Afterlife from what I can think of. So yeah, just not very impressive. So even in Limited this seems like a fairly weak card, and in Constructed this seems terrible. Next we have Kyrian Imp. Look at this guy. The common, and already looks a whole lot better than the Infiltrator. It costs 4, is a 2/3 flyer, which is very decent, and yeah, you can exile target creature from a graveyard to gain 2 life when it enters the battlefield. Nothing insane or anything, but 2/3 means that it holds the air pretty well, is an okay clock in the air, and also has some additional disruptive defensive value with the enter battlefield trigger. So seems like a fine 4-drop, unless your deck is too aggressive that you rather have more stats than the flying and the ability, but definitely a fine 4-drop at the very least. Limited. Next we have Catacomb Crocodile. This is a whole lot better than the usual 5-mana 3/5s that we get to see. Also those are usually in white. This is in black, which arguably makes it better because black creatures tend to be smaller normally. So yeah, a 5-cost 3/7 seems like a pretty good defensive creature. Nothing too exciting, and your deck has to be defensive enough to care about this. But if it is, a 3/7 locks up the ground really well, and then for example lets you pressure the opponent in the air with your Afterlife creatures, for example. Stuff like that. So yeah, pretty robust common, I would think, in Limited. Next we have Clear this the stage. So for 5 mana we get a Last Gasp, which is not too impressive for the cost, but still a fine effect, although at that point in the game it often won't kill too much of relevance anymore. Sometimes some flyers that are still annoying, but on the ground most things that this can kill are not that relevant anymore unless they have good activated abilities. But if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you may return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So basically if you have the second mode enabled, this card is really powerful, especially because it is an instant, so you can use it in combat as well, and it's a pretty strong 2-for-1, so it seems easily on the power level of something like Gravedigger, which is always a premium common in Limited. Just make sure that you have a bunch of cards that can meet the second criteria, because if you don't meet that, the card's pretty underwhelming and nothing you'd be excited to have in your Limited deck. Alright, next we have Consign to the Pit. 6 mana, destroy a creature, and yeah, you deal 2 damage to the creature's controller. Nothing exciting. 6 mana removal, especially sorcery removal, is very clunky, but you know, sometimes you just gotta deal with that one big guy or that one spoiler bomb that your opponent has, and this gets the job done, no questions asked. So yeah, I can see one of these making it in your like non-aggressive decks, but it's really not great. It's really clunky, and especially in aggressive decks, 6 usually is too much. Next we have Cry of the Canarian, another take on the classic Infest. This time you exile all creatures in all graveyards that were put there from the battlefield this turn, and you also exile all creatures that would die this turn instead of putting them in a graveyard. So yeah, just a nice infest type 3 buff for 3 that also suppresses certain die triggers and gets rid of some graveyard shenanigans, which is a nice upside. So this seems like a very solid role player in Constructed, and also a pretty solid card at the very least in Limited, depending on how well it lines up with the format as a whole and your opponent's deck specifically. This could go up to a premium uncommon level, but more often than not it's probably going to be a bit more situational and fine, but not insane. Next we have Dead Revels. So for 4 mana sorcery, we basically get a salvage, except for 1 mana more, but with Spectacle it costs 1 mana less than salvage, and I mean salvage has been a pretty solid card in Dominaria, and this is not that much of a difference, but the difference between 2 and 3 mana is actually pretty big, because for 2 mana this is a whole lot of better deal. So if your deck can Spectacle this reasonably well and yeah, has stuff trading, or you should trade aggressively with this in your deck, I can totally see one of this being a very solid addition to a lot of limited decks. Next we have Depth's Transport. It's a 6-cost 5/3, has Afterlife 2, nothing too exciting here. Might be a little bit too expensive for how low the toughness is in limited, but should be at least a fine filler as a one-off, and could be a card that I'm underrating a bit, but the 3 toughness makes me really reluctant in conjunction with the 6 cost. Next we have Drill Bit. That's pretty sweet. So we get a coercion that with Spectacle basically turns into a Thoughtseize that doesn't lose you any life. So in Constructed, I think this is actually a pretty interesting card for aggressive decks like Mono Black aggro or Rakdos aggro type decks that have a low curve and then can just enable this on turn 2 or 3, play a 1 or 2 drop alongside it, or for example go like 1 drop into 2 drop into removal plus attack, and then like 2 cost removal and then use your last mana to Drill Bit the opponent, stuff like that. We all know how good Thoughtseize type effects can be, and this is no different. It's just pretty restricted in terms of what decks want it, because obviously for 3 as a coercion it's pretty bad. In Limited, however, I don't think this is too exciting, but it seems fine as a filler, at least in Limited. And obviously goes up if you can Spectacle that more, and or your opponent has some bombs you gotta get rid of post-sideboard. Next we have Font of Agonies. Whenever you pay life, put that many blood counters on Font of Agonies, and you get to remove 4 counters and pay 2 mana to destroy target creature. This seems very specific, and you can only like pay that much life in a game, so how much removal can you expect to get out of this? If you play this early and have ways to aggressively pay life, you might get 2 or maybe if you're lucky 3 activations out of it, at which point it obviously would be pretty good. But yeah, not sure what to pair this with and if it's even worth it. So I doubt it's going to do anything in Constructed, but it seems the kind of card that could do something if there's enough natural support with it, enough good life loss, controllable life loss cards that you want to play anyway, and then this suddenly turns into a pretty nice value removal, especially because the removal is not restricted, just destroys target creature, no questions asked. But yeah, unlikely to get there, and in Limited, of course, this is even harder to support. And last but not least, for the first part, we have Grotesque Demise, functional reprint, exile target creature with power 3 or less. Since it costs 3, it's pretty pricey, since usually the things it will exile will cost the same or less. Not that much tempo to be gained here, but it deals with some of the annoying afterlife creatures without giving them tokens, which can be pretty good. For example, the 3-cost 2/1 that gives 2 tokens and stuff like that. So, and some of the flyers, like a lot of the flyers that we've seen so far, die to this. So in Limited it seems like a fine option, not great though, so you don't want too many of those. And in Constructed there's just better, cheaper, more flexible options usually. But there's always the chance that this somehow ends up in small numbers in some sideboard out of necessity, but unlikely. Okay, and that is part 1 of the black cards. I will of course be back tomorrow with part 2 of the black cards. And until then, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, share it with your friends, let me know in the comments what you think. Also, please subscribe to the channel, turn on notification icon to not miss out on future content if you haven't yet. I will be producing more MTG content in the future as well as other games. And one last thing, please help support the free content by whitelisting YouTube in your ad block. That would really mean a lot. Yeah, that's it again for this time. I'm your host ManuS. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!